Good morning to everyone. Well, let me start by thanking Carsten Fink, our chief economist, and his team, who are all here for what we believe is extremely important work and very interesting work on innovation. So innovation, of course, has been the flavour of the month for some time now. And what we've chosen in this particular report is to look at the geography of innovation and how that affects innovation patterns. Of course, there we have a somewhat different geography to that which we might have had some 50 years ago. What the report clearly establishes is that local hubs are extremely important. And they're important for a variety of reasons. A concentration of skilled workers and scientists and people working in research and development gives a possibility of exchange of ideas, and it builds a momentum. So we see this phenomenon of local hubs. But at the same time, of course, digital technology permits connections across the world. So thus the title of the report, which is Local Hotspots and Global Networks. And it explores these two phenomena, the phenomena of hubs, but the phenomenon also of how they connect and interconnect. What are some of the main findings of the report? Let me go through those briefly, and then Carsten is going to take over. What the report does, in addition to dealing with those, with that general question of geography, is to look at two case studies in detail, and those case studies are on autonomous vehicles on the one hand, and how that has been evolving, and agricultural biotechnology on the other hand. So as far as the main findings of the report are concerned, the first is, of course, as I have really mentioned already, that innovation is geographically concentrated in a limited number of areas. The top 30 hotspots, if you like, accounted between themselves for 69% of patents and 48% of scientific activity during the period 2015-2017. So that's a big concentration. I should have mentioned that in order to produce these findings, we have gone through millions of patent applications and scientific publications in the course of the last decades. Now, these top 30 are mostly located in 5 countries: China, Germany, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the United States of America. And we're familiar with the particular hotspots there: Tokyo, Seoul, Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Frankfurt. They all feature among the top 30 hotspots. Finding number 2 is that innovation is at the same time increasingly collaborative in nature. So this is the general picture of economic geography. Increasingly collaborative. So in the early 2000s, two teams of scientists produced 64% of... in the early 2000s, teams of scientists produced 64% of all scientific papers, and teams of inventors produced 54% of all patents. By the end of the second half of the 2010, right, so go forward another 15 years or so, and those figures have grown to 88% and 68%. Okay, so from 64% in the early 2000s of all scientific published papers produced by teams go to 88%. And from 54% for teams behind patents go to 68%. So this is significant sort of confirmation of collaboration as being an extremely important feature of innovation now. Why? Well, probably complexity. The complexity of technology and the intersection of technologies and the fact that, you know, you're not working on one thing in isolation, but it's multidisciplinary, and this, no doubt, is a big contributor. One more comment, one more finding, general finding. Collaboration also is increasingly international in nature. And there are figures which I will give on this. So the share of scientific collaborations with 2 or more researchers located in different countries, okay? 15% in 1998, 25% in 2017. So again, we see not only teams, but international teams. Then the figures actually don't go in the same direction for patents. The share of international co-inventions, it increased to 11% until 2009, but it's since then slightly fallen. Now that's an interesting thing. I don't know whether Carsten's got any explanations for it. I'll give you one little explanation, possible explanation, in just one moment. Top international hotspots, then in terms of international collaboration, and the largest 10 of them, I think, account for 26% of all international collaborations. So you see this impact, this effect of locally important hotspots for various reasons, but they're connected. Okay, let me just say a word then about some of the speculations that one can make on the basis of this. I hope that doesn't offend our empirical colleagues, our economists here, but Carsten will gently correct me, as usual, if I go astray. So, obviously, innovation now is globally interlinked. Now, at the same time, in this world, we see important signs of closure. And those signs of closure, you know, there are quite a number of them. I read about it every day in your writings. So foreign direct investment has gone down for the last 3 years, globally, for example. The number of protectionist actions taken is going up. And that's also documented in various studies. The review of mergers and acquisitions on the basis of critical infrastructure or security has become tighter. And not just in one country, by the way. This has happened in several countries. There is a lot of discussion in your media about universities and foreign participation in universities. So we're seeing, I think, a number of signs of closure, and I'm going well beyond the report here, I'm just talking generally. But at the same time, this report is telling us that innovation has become more international, more internationally connected. And so that is, I think, an interesting dilemma for all of us to think about. The nature of science and innovation now requires international collaboration, like so many other things. But we're living a tense moment in certain respects. I think that's probably the main comment that I would make. There are a lot of other things you can say, of course. Governments can promote openness. You know, obviously, that's something coming out of what I've just said. There is a large policy space for promoting openness, and that, I think, is the space in which governments have to try to operate in order to maximise the advantage that they can take of innovation in a world that is telling us that science and technology and innovation are increasingly globally interconnected, even if local hotspots are extremely important. So there we are, Carsten, perhaps.
Thank you, Director General. Let me maybe start by just saying a few more words about this question of international collaboration and what we find in the case of patents and international co-inventorships, where it is true that if you look at the trend, and we were surprised by that when we looked at these data, that since about 2010, the share of international co-inventions has slightly fallen. Now, when we looked at the data in greater detail, there is an interesting story here. You look at the absolute number of international co-inventions, that has continued to rise, and that has continued to rise for virtually every country. So as far as the global picture is concerned, it's still the case that we see more and more international collaborations. However, in a few jurisdictions, we have also seen very fast growth of domestic collaborations. And that is especially the case in China, where you have seen huge growth, as you know, and as we have reported many times, of domestic patenting in China. And that has gone along with a lot of, domestic collaboration. So while, international collaboration is still rising in absolute terms, as a share, international collaboration in the case of patents has fallen in the case of China. And we see a similar trend in the United States. There it's less pronounced in terms of the numbers, but it's also the case that we still see an increasing absolute number of collaborations, but we also see very strong growth in domestic collaborations, and that accounts for a slightly falling share. If I may, I'd like to point out two or three more things that emerge out of the report. One is that if you look at who is behind innovation and who is behind these global innovation networks that we characterize with our rich data, it is quite clear that multinational companies play an important role. We can see that companies have spread out their research and development activities to different parts of the world. We see this whenever companies file patents and there are inventors that are listed that are located around the world. Essentially, that phenomenon has always existed, but we have seen that, this what we refer to as international patent sourcing has grown over time. It has included more and more countries. And we have some specific example. You look at a company like Google, which is, of course, headquartered in the Silicon Valley. But we find that the researchers of Google in the Silicon Valley account for only slightly half than the company's patenting activities. And you have other innovation hubs appearing in Google's patent portfolio. Other American cities, New York City is the second largest location of Google inventors. But you also have Zurich and London emerge as quite important locations. We also see, and that is interesting, multinational companies from middle-income countries. Take the example of Embraer, a Brazilian company, or Infosys, an Indian company. They increasingly rely on the innovation hotspots for the most part in the high-income countries when they source their innovation. So you have a number of these middle-income multinational companies who actively take part in these global innovation networks. One or two words about the case studies that are included in our report. One, as the Director General mentioned, focuses on autonomous vehicles technology. And that is, of course, an interesting one because what we see there is a broadening of the innovation landscape, and you have tech companies who have entered the innovation domain there. And that also means that if you look at the geography of innovation, it has expanded to include hotspots that traditionally were not at the center of automotive innovation. Again, that's of course the case for Silicon Valley, But we also see in our data cities such as Los Angeles in the US or Berlin in Germany, appear as important hotspots of inventive activity. In the case of agricultural biotechnology, this is the field where we probably see the most widespread innovation landscape, where you also have some of these, what we refer to as specialized clusters in developing economies, including in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. And that, to a good extent, reflects the nature of the technology, because agricultural biotechnology innovations need adaptation to local, regional, agroecological conditions. It's still the case, though, that most innovative activity, if you quantify it in terms of number of patents and scientific publications, takes place in China, Germany, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the United States. They respectively count for 55% of scientific activity and 80% of all patents. And what is interesting, within those economies, most of that innovation takes place in the urban hotspots. It's innovation that eventually serves agricultural land, but the innovation for the most part takes place in cities. And let me just end with one note that we raise in the report, which I think presents probably one of the most important challenges that policymakers face these days. If you look at data on how different regions within countries have done over the last 20 years, we see that in many high-income countries there has been a growing phenomenon of regional divergence of income, wages, high-skilled jobs, employment opportunities, with some champion regions within countries doing particularly well, but others are less successful at igniting the same type of economic activity. And that, of course, is a much broader phenomenon. It goes beyond innovation, but it is, of course, the case that the successful innovation hotspots that we identify in the report and that accounts for most innovation are also the ones that are most open to the world. They're the ones that are most embedded in these global innovation networks. And we have this interesting example of Israel in the report. And Israel is, as many of you know, an economy that really has managed to have strong growth in its innovation economy. It has earned the nickname, Startup Nation. If you look closely at the data, most of the innovative activity in Israel takes place in Tel Aviv, in the central district of Israel. So Tel Aviv accounts for something like 77% of all startups and 60% of all high-tech jobs in Israel. And there are growing concerns, and Israeli policymakers have responded to that, about what that means for essentially the regional divergence of incomes within the country. It's an important challenge for policymakers simply because it's very difficult to reverse this gravitational pull that exists towards the big, metropolitan hotspots. But there are obviously, ways in which policymakers can help regions that are less successful to make sure that the growth benefits that innovation brings about are widely shared. Let me leave it at that, and of course we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I forgot to mention that this is all under embargo until tomorrow 3 p.m., which is when our launch event is happening at WIPO in the WIPO conference hall, which of course you're all invited to. Questions? I believe Catherine Fianquion, then Isabella from
Yes, good morning. Catherine Fianquion for France 24. You just spoke about the better domestic collaboration and the collaborations between countries and regions. So could you elaborate a bit about Africa? Are there particular hotspots in Africa now about innovation, East African, West Africa? And does the continent collaborate with other countries or hotspots in the world? Thank you.
Yeah, I can't give you an immediate answer to that, except in saying that in this case study on agricultural biotechnology, we do identify a number of hotspots that have specialized expertise in crop biotechnology, and I think especially in the scientific realm of it, and we could give you the names of those. And you would see that there is some international collaboration, mostly I would say with universities and with research outfits in Europe and the United States, to some extent also maybe Asia. So I can't give you any figures right away, but we'd be happy to, and to some extent I think you would find it in the report, but there's a lot of rich data we sit on, so we would be quite happy to share that with you.
To be more precise, for instance, we know that Kenya is a very innovating country. So is it considered as a hotspot, and do you see an increase of innovation in that region, in Eastern Africa?
I'm sure Kenya is in there, and I'm trying to remember, I looked at the map of African countries this morning, so Kenya was definitely in there. I think there were one or two other African countries, but I don't want to say anything that I come to regret, so I would, and in fact the colleague who has worked on this agricultural biotechnology case study is here, and I think she would be happy to supply you with the relevant data. Yes.
Isabella, then Emma.
Good morning, Isabel Saco for Ethics Spanish News. I see that that you are underlining the concentration of knowledge, of innovation. This concentration is in the hands of, I understand, of mainly of huge transnational companies. What is the problem? What is the problem of concentration of inventions, of innovation, knowledge for the world, for the rest of the world, that don't have this?
So look, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure what you mean by the problem.
Maybe there is no problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we've done is try to observe the landscape and say this is how it is. Now, I think it's then for you to take judgments on whether you consider the scale of concentration to be unhealthy or not. And in a sense, going back to Katrine's question about Africa, I think a lot has to do with scale. Naturally, what comes out in looking at all the data are those great concentrations. And so that's what we focus on in order to draw the global picture. And in that detail, of course, those that are maybe doing extremely important things, but not on the same scale, tend to get lost a little bit. Now, is there a concentration? Well, obviously there is a concentration. There are certain hotspots. But at the same time, we have most governments in the world trying to encourage just that. They're trying to build their own Silicon Valleys or whatever it might be, not always successfully. So I think the lesson number one is that an area which does have a concentration of researchers, of enterprises, and which is open, it tends to be successful in the area of innovation. So governments try to emulate that and create those circumstances. Now, is the degree of concentration unhealthy? I think I wouldn't make a comment on that necessarily, except to say that we are seeing that, and it's something that people need to take cognizance of and take their own views on. Carsten?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the one point I would maybe add is that, and that also comes out of our report, that technology is becoming more and more complex. And there is evidence that research and development productivity is falling, which means it takes more and more resources to achieve the same kind of technological progress that we've seen in the past. Give you a specific example, there's some research that was done by economists at Stanford University that has looked at the famous law by Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, who in the 1970s predicted that the capacity of computer chips would double every year. Now, if you look at the data, that Moore's law seems to hold pretty much until today. However, it takes about 18 times more efforts in terms of R&D dollars to achieve that type of progress compared to the 1970s. And I think that has to do with scale. I think tackling some of the big technological problems of today really requires large-scale investment in research and development. Autonomous driving is another good example. The kind of artificial intelligence that needs to be programmed for autonomous vehicles to work, that takes a lot of researchers, a lot of investments, and that naturally means that it's something that larger companies who have the scale are better equipped to do. And I think that is something that we see in many fields of technology. What ultimately that concentration means in terms of market competition, of course, is another question which is difficult.
Emma Barge from Reuters. I was just wondering if you could say whether you still see Silicon Valley as the #1 hotspot, or whether you see a change in that sort of ranking.
Look, Carsten, you might like to make a comment on this. Obviously, Silicon Valley is one of the top hotspots. Now, what we have used as the principal indicators for hotspots are patent applications and scientific publications. Innovation is more complex, and we try to measure it in various different ways. And one of the things that is, of course, frustrating is that it's very difficult to judge the impact of innovations. So you can look at numbers, but what changes the world in extraordinary ways? I mean, perhaps not the greatest example, but the technology behind Facebook. Could you say from that, looking at that and looking at the numbers, that it would have the impact of having 800 million people, or however many it is, worldwide connected, and being such an extraordinary phenomenon? So innovation, I think, is very complex, but Silicon Valley's right up there, obviously,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the numbers, Silicon Valley would be among the top 5. It's not the top hotspot by our counts of patents and scientific publications. But keep in mind that we count these things in absolute terms. Tokyo is the biggest one, and I think that has a lot to do, of course, that Tokyo is very innovative, but also it's a huge metropolitan agglomeration. So we don't, in some sense, adjust, these ranks, if you wish, by the underlying size of these hotspots. Having said this, I think what we see, especially, and that is actually quite fascinating, in our collaboration data, the Silicon Valley is one of the most collaborative hotspots. It has, among the biggest ties in the world. And much more so than many of the Asian hotspots. And I think, that's really quite interesting. Other than that, I would just invite you to our launch event tomorrow, where we have a really well-known economist from UC Berkeley, and she has spent her life studying Silicon Valley and what has made what explains the kind of success that Silicon Valley has, and I think what she will say will go beyond what we write in the report, but I look forward to that.
Great. John?
I was wondering, in your analysis, did you look at the pushback from R&D cash pushed by governments. The top 5 are also the governments that spend the most in R&D, especially the case of US, China, Japan, Korea and Germany.
Yes.
And secondly, the government element, in other words, facilitating the R&D. You've got a chapter talking about the DAPA, the US Department of Defense, pushing. Secondly, you don't capture the innovations of the defense scientists worldwide, do you, in this study?
On the last one, it's true that there is not full transparency here. Now, but nor is, what we need to notice is that there is a huge interaction between civilian and military. A lot of inventions, GPS, come out of the military and then have a civilian application. The internet itself, So there is this huge interaction, and similarly, civilian technology influences military technology. So this is a large, relatively unexplored territory, relatively. And relatively because, of course, a lot of military technology is secret. Now, a number of countries, United States, United Kingdom, Germany, I believe, and several others, run a system whereby they have a security person, really, who looks at all incoming patent applications from their nationals and decides whether it should be taken out of the commercial stream because of its military implications. And that's a system that's been around for a long while. It's not new. They're called secret patents. And then they determine a remuneration system for those patents that are taken out of circulation. And indeed, for a country like the United States, and it's not alone in its approach in this area, you can't file as a national a patent application for the first time outside the United States of America without security clearance. So this is a big area, and it's not, it merits a whole study on its own, and even then, not all the data are going to be available.
On this very issue, but you have a situation where you're talking about the civilians' influence in the military, where facial recognition now is getting more sophisticated in the commercial sector than the military.
Look, I think, it's perhaps not alone, as an example. So there is a big interaction here. But by the way, that's historically a very, old interaction. Leonardo da Vinci wrote to the Duke of Milan and said, "Here, hire me because I've got the best military technology around," basically, summarising his letter.
The civilian component, the monetisation, this study is not telling us who's making money out of all this. So who's cashing in?
On what?
On all these inventions, who's running away with the cash? Which of the hubs is making the most cash?
Oh, on all of this, we leave the military and we go to the general.
As you know, Australia's a great invention country. It doesn't necessarily commercialise a lot of the inventions.
Yeah, who's making the money? Well, I turn to the economists.
Let me maybe be evasive and try to answer the first question you posed. I think what you said is absolutely right. If you look at, our hotspots, a lot of them, have a government footprint, which, could be the funding of universities, which could be, especially in the case of agricultural biotechnology, the funding of public research organizations. And especially in developing countries, we see that plays an important role. I think on the government funding question, and you mentioned DARPA, there's a very interesting story in our autonomous vehicle case study, because autonomous vehicle research really took off starting after 2005, and that followed several DARPA-funded prize competitions where it was essentially the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, and Stanford University who competed for these prizes. I think they were won by different universities at different times. But what is interesting is that you look at what happened to the researchers who participated in these competitions. Many of them then essentially moved to WIPO, and some of them founded their own companies that are now engaged in trying to commercialize that technology. And I think it is very interesting because, it's similar to the story of semiconductors. We did some research on that several years ago, where really the origins of, let's say the initial push for the technology really came from DARPA, which is a arm of the U.S. Defense Department.
CCTV, and then
So I have a very simple question. I just want to confirm this report is released and published every 2 years. And this report is all the details from the 2015-2017 line. Any data from the 2018 last year?
Well, the report takes a theme rather than a time period. So the theme this time, as opposed to the other ones that we've done, is geography of innovation. So that's studied over a long period of time, not just over 2015, 2017. But many of the data, of course, also relate to 2015-17 as a comparison point in time.
Right. I mean, first of all, we do look at longer-term trends in this report. So I think, for example, the latest patent statistics you would find in our World Intellectual Property Indicators that, in fact, we released last month. Also, without going into the technical details here, for this report, we rely on information on published patents. There's always a delay between when patents are filed and published. So the latest data we look at in the case of patents, indeed, it's 2017, and even there we face some truncation issue. But I think the purpose of the report is very much to look at longer-term trends and not necessarily at the development in the latest year.
okay.
Yes, okay. I have a question broadly on the report. I mean, you mentioned about concentration domestically with the hotspots. So, and you also mentioned the fact that the governments are the government footprint in this hotspot. I mean, it makes sense because the control of innovation system is important also geopolitically. Right? Now, I was wondering regarding the global networks aspect of the report, whether you see somehow decoupling, meaning that certain global networks will be concentrated geographically between certain countries because there is also geopolitics behind. I mean, this is also, I would say, the worry in the so-called trade war between the US and China. Yes. That we will have two parallel innovation spheres, and countries will have to choose between the two. So do you witness that in the global network dimension?
So, look, I think it's a little beyond, it's going beyond the scope of the report, and what the report does, of course, is present evidence of certain trends to which you have alluded. And then what we can draw from that, I think, is it's still a game in play. It's not a finished game. So my own view is that, we do have a lot of evidence in this report, but more generally, historically, that openness engenders innovation. The influence of people coming. You can take Baghdad in the 900s and 1000 was a great open centre. Historically, there are many examples. Venice, the Republic of Venice in the 1400s, many examples that you can point to where you can see this effect of openness. And now it's no secret that there are important pressures for closure. So now how that's going to play out, and whether it's going to play out in terms of having an impact also on innovation, well, we have to watch, I would say. But we do see that many of the important signs of closure relate to technology. And they relate to innovation. They're not just general. I mean, there are many protectionist measures which might have no connection really with technology, but there are many that do. And there are many other policy measures taken that do. So I'd say this is a game that we're all witnessing at the moment, and I wouldn't draw any conclusions.
I agree with that. I think the question you ask is a really interesting one, but it is difficult to answer. But I think take something like Brexit. I can imagine that Brexit might affect the way that British researchers interact with researchers on the European continent. How exactly, I think nobody knows at this point. That depends a lot on future access of British researcher to European financing mechanisms and so on. And I think it's difficult to predict. And maybe at some point we will be able to assess that. But it's certainly not something that we have tried to do in the report. And especially, I think, as far as some of the recent trends are concerned, I think it would be too early.
I've got to follow up to Yanel's question, if no one has a question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. You had your phone.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Hi, I'm Jamie, Associate Press. This is all touching on, I mean, you say in your own report, that innovation has sort of been concentrated for generations, for centuries, really. I mean, I'm trying to really understand, why are we studying the geography of innovation to begin with? In other words, I mean, to say that farming is done in the fields is kind of a natural thing. We've seen urbanization. I mean, in countries like China, you see people in droves gravitating towards cities. So I'm not quite sure what we're trying to glean from this, just laying out of the data. So that's my first thing. The second thing is, how did you pick these themes? Like, for example, with, so you've talked a little bit about, you've got plant value technology, auto tech. What about financial sector? Was that ever in consideration? Because there's a lot of innovation being done there, particularly here in Switzerland. Is there, and healthcare? I mean, why did you pick those industries specifically?
Okay, so look, basically your first question is, well, this is obvious, and so why are you telling us about it? I don't think it's completely obvious, I don't think it's completely obvious where the hotspots are. And this data tells you, it gives you an empirical basis for being able to identify them. Of course, we all have our intuitive notion, of course, Silicon Valley, and then maybe Boston and then of course Shenzhen and so on. This is giving you the data which will validate it, and it's making the important observation, I think, that a local hotspot is something that works in innovation. And that, I think, is a message to policymakers. Of course, you're quite right in saying, well, maybe they already know this, or it's been around for a while, or it's fairly obvious, but they have to craft their economic strategy for innovation, and this is telling you that if you dissipate your efforts, you maybe are not going to be as successful as if you concentrate your efforts in certain areas and try to build up those.
But you're not actually making recommendations for policymakers in that regard.
No, we leave it to them to draw the conclusions, really. So that's that. Now, why autonomous vehicles and why agricultural biotechnology? Well, you're quite right. I mean, there's innovation going on right across the spectrum, and we have chosen in these reports over several years a number of different areas. not just these areas. So, Carsten, you might like to say something.
Yeah,
on
I,
that.
mean, I would just say that I wouldn't say it's completely arbitrary, but generally what we try with these reports, we try to get an understanding of the macro picture. And most of the report is really about the macro picture. We have also included, some case studies to study more specifically how the geography of innovation plays out in particular fields of innovation. We chose autonomous vehicles and agricultural biotechnology because we felt that these are, first of all, they're two quite different fields, but if they have one thing in common is there's a lot happening in terms of technological change, and the phase of the industry is changing. Listen, in past reports, we have looked at 3D printing, we have looked at airplanes, we have looked at robotics, we have looked at nanotechnology. Obviously these case studies, health also.
The GI.
In the GI. So with all of our reports, we try to have a broad look. Since you mentioned, the financial sector, for next year's Global Innovation Index, we are planning to do something on the financing of innovation. Obviously, if you want to go deeper, you have to pick and choose a little bit. This was really driven by, I would say, opportunities for us to interact with, interesting or with capable researchers who helped us doing this more than anything else.
Any more questions? John?
Coming back to what you were saying about the limitations, again from Dinel's question, are you seeing also limitations on the basic research papers? I've seen some referencing that there are attempts that's been tried in the past to limit basic research in Western countries from being shared if it's considered sensitive.
I don't know about that. I wouldn't be able to answer that. I mean, these policy measures to which I referred earlier in terms of secret patents that's a well-known track.
The question is
now,
research papers.
I don't know about that. I don't know anything about that. What we do see is that there is closer scrutiny exercised with respect to universities and personnel. So we've seen that. I mean, you're writing about it on an almost daily basis. So there are plenty of examples of that I needn't go into. Now, whether it's been focused on particular research, I don't know.
The more sensitive the research area, they're focusing on areas that are cutting edge, where these basic papers are considered cutting edge, and there's policy talk.
I don't know. Yeah. Look, I understand where you're going, and I can't give an answer to it because to give a complete answer, you would have to start to look at funding sources as well. Now, funding sources, a lot of universities do contract research. It's not their own money. They're doing it either for a corporation or for a government, and they bid for these. So those particular research contracts also would have restrictions in them about dissemination, first for commercial reasons, and then secondly, perhaps for security reasons. So it's a vast area to study, I think.
Yes, I'm It's a question, just a precision on the figure you gave before. For the 30 metropolitan hotspots to account for 69% of patents and 48% of scientific activity. For the patents, are you talking about international patents or national patents?
All patents, yes.
Well, in this particular case, we're talking about so-called foreign-oriented patent families. So on the one hand, and there are some technical data reasons behind that, so these are patent families, so essentially we look at groups of patents that relate to the same inventions. So in many cases, an invention is filed, is applied for a patent in one country, and then the applicant seeks a patent for the same invention in another country, and we wouldn't count those patents separately. We sort of look at families of patents for the same inventions. But for this particular statistic, that relates to essentially patents where indeed the inventor has applied for patent protection in more than one country. And that's partly because these are, I would say, generally the more valuable patents. But these are also the ones for which we simply have more complete data. And these are also the ones that are more comparable internationally. I'd leave it at that.
So it's patterns presented in one and more.
Exactly. More than one country.
Could you elaborate on what you said on the middle income countries doing innovation, and I think you mentioned that they have also, there are also middle income countries companies which are present in other countries. Is that right? Doing innovation in other countries? Right. And if this is correct, is it because they have partners, Western partners, or high income countries companies partners? They have investment, foreign investment, receiving foreign investment, and that's why they are outside their country. You can explain. And in the share of this innovation of patents and in the share of scientific activity, what is the share of middle income countries? They have any share?
On the second one, we can give you the figure. We have it somewhere. What you would find is that the middle income country share is dominated by China. So China accounts for a huge amount of it. But we can certainly give you these figures. I think on your first question, we are looking at companies. I mentioned the examples of Infosys, Embraer, which is a Brazilian company, and they have investments in other countries. And as part of their establishments in other countries, they engage in research and development.
They work in partnership with.
If I may, I think you've mentioned a lot of possibilities.
Yes.
You yourself. And one way of looking at it is that each company, in this instance, each enterprise is trying to maximise its innovation possibilities. And they'll do that by their own in-house R&D, but also by creating as many relationships with the external world as they can. That's the sort of basic premise of open innovation, is that it's unlikely that you have within your own company all the expertise in the world. So you've got to reach out and create relationships. Now, you might do that through investment. You might do it by buying research, by contracting research. There are a whole range of mechanisms that you can. What I think the report's saying is that this is happening. The international collaborations are being established, and have been established, and it's happening more. And it's also happening in middle income countries, as Carsten has just mentioned.
And just to clarify, and you mentioned these 5 countries, that this is in the order of their
importance. Importance in numbers. Yes.
First China.
No, I think this is alphabetical order.
Alphabetical.
Would you give the order by importance?
I can definitely tell you the United States has the largest number of these hotspots, followed by, I think, China and Germany. But we can give you these numbers. It's always difficult.
You confirm this?
Pardon me?
Could you confirm this?
Yeah.
Yes.
And maybe what page of the report, if that is there, because I'm struggling to find that.
Yeah, it's in any case in the GI.
Right.
I was wondering,
The list.
to what extent is there a correlation that some of these hotspots are also located in the most wide and high-tech locations where the synergies can happen, and also the logistics are good?
Yeah, I think, what is interesting about these hotspots, you look at them and there's some, look at Boston, where you can clearly see that the scientific environment is probably at the root of the hotspot. You look at another one, maybe it's an extreme, San Diego. It's essentially one company, Qualcomm, that has huge R&D facilities in San Diego, and they make up most of the hotspot. You also have some smaller, what we call niche clusters in the report, which are not necessarily the large metropolitan areas. These could be smaller cities. I think Bern in Switzerland is one of them, where in one specialized field you may have a few companies that are particularly capable. And that is actually quite interesting. I think the story behind each of these hotspots is not necessarily the same.
So there's no magic formula for these hotspots?
I think that's right, because otherwise everyone would have reinvented Silicon Valley.
And maybe just also trying to answer that in a sense is really interesting. There's a lot of persistence in these hotspots. In a sense, technology changes, quite dramatically from generation to generation, and that's why a place like Silicon Valley is so interesting, because in many ways, it's the same area, but the companies and the innovation system in many ways has reinvented itself, and that also makes it difficult for policymakers to say, I want my own Silicon Valley. It's just something that's very difficult to plan. There's a lot of it's locally grown in many ways.
I think we have one last question.
Liu Ji from China Xinhua. Back to the concentration. You mentioned that the innovations, global innovations, are more concentrated on a number of specific countries, to which a large contributor behind this is the multinational companies. For example, like Google, less than 20% of the innovation are limited to their campuses in Silicon Valley, and a large part are attributed to London, Zurich, and New York. But in the case of China, we don't see a fast-growing number of multinational brand names during the past couple of years. So could it be said that there's a pattern difference behind this concentration of innovation in China, or if not, what do you think is the major driving force behind the concentration of innovation in China?
Well, that's a big question. That's a really big question. I think it involves the intersection of a whole range of government policies that are taking place at the central level and at the municipal level, because municipalities, as you know better than I, in China are very active in trying to encourage certain types of environment, and in particular innovation. You see that in Shenzhen, you see it in Shanghai, you see it in Beijing, you see the various triangles, the Beijing triangle with Tianjin and Hubei. So I'm not sure I can give one single answer to your question, really. And then you get this phenomenon of certain companies being extremely successful, and that breeds others in the area. That's an interesting thing too. And why have they become so successful? Is it the technology itself, or is it their capacity to market it? Is it the interlinkages? I think it's complex. I would. A specific example of this companies? Well, Alibaba is a company that's an example. Tencent, Baidu. These are all iFlyTech. There are many. And you could name similar ones in the United States or wherever you go. And they obviously are going to have an influence. Carsten just mentioned Qualcomm in San Diego as an example.